Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland was published in 2013 in the collection The Invention of Fireworks. This narrative poem is told through the eyes of the persona of the daughter of a failed kamikaze pilot. We learn that rather than going through with the suicide mission upon which he has been sent, he turns his plane around and returns home. The dishonour that his actions have brought on himself and his family is, however, irrevocable. Shunned by his wife, his neighbours, and eventually his children, he lives with the consequences of his failure as an outcast for the rest of his life. Do, however, keep in mind that this is a totally fictitious account created in the imagination of the poet, and may not bear any resemblance to what actually happened to kamikaze pilots who refused to obey these orders. The poem comprises 7 stanzas of 6 lines each. There is no rhyme scheme or regular rhythmic pattern, although most lines have 3 or 4 stressed syllables. There's a significant amount of enjambment, not only across line breaks but also across stanza breaks, and there are only 3 sentences, defined by full stops, in total, the fluency of which lends the poem the feel of a story being told aloud. The first sentence is 5 stanzas or 30 lines long, and mainly describes what the daughter imagines her father could see from his cockpit. The second sentence is 10 lines long and is where we find out that he did not go through with the mission after all. The final sentence is merely 2 lines long. Both the diction and structure of the poem reflect the way in which it emerges that this is a story being told by the pilot's daughter to her own children, some of which is in reported speech and some of which is in direct speech. The poet chooses simple language and very visual imagery, which would be appropriate and appealing to children. The poem switches from the third-person limited point of view, i.e. the narrator only knows the thoughts and feelings of a single character, in this case the daughter, to the first-person point of view, where the daughter herself briefly becomes the narrator, and then back to the third-person limited. These changes are signalled by a change from normal font to italic, and then back again. These shifts in time and speaker are jarring and unsettling, perhaps reflecting the daughter's conflicted feelings about what her father did. The third-person limited point of view effectively renders the central character, the pilot, voiceless, reflecting the way in which he was treated on his return. The daughter can only speculate about what made her father turn the plane around. The poem can be divided into 2 sections, the first of which, up to the end of the 5th stanza, has an abundance of figurative language and imagery appealing to the senses of sight, particularly colours such as green-blue, silver, pearl grey and black, taste such as salt-sodden, and touch such as feathery and muscular. Words such as silver, pearl grey and prince form a semantic field relating to wealth and fairy tales. It could be argued that the daughter perhaps employs this kind of language, not only as a storytelling technique, but also as a means of rationalising and justifying her father's actions to herself in retrospect. The second section, in contrast, from the beginning of the 6th stanza to the end, is completely devoid of figurative language. The dry, factual tone perhaps reflecting the father's joyless and empty existence, as he is deliberately deprived of any kind of human connection. The sea is central to 4 of the poem's 7 stanzas, and has a timeless quality, evoking a traditional way of life going back generations, the ties to which the pilot is able to see clearly from above, and which remind him of what he is about to lose. The one-word Japanese title, Kamikaze, translates as divine wind, and was applied to Japan's special attack units which were sent on suicide missions during the Second World War. During the closing stages of the Pacific Campaign in October 1944, things were looking bleak for the Japanese, and it was a last-ditch attempt to ward off the Allied warships which were approaching the Japanese islands. Planes, which were effectively human-controlled guided missiles, were loaded with explosives, and the pilot would attempt to crash them into the ships. Even though they had a mere 19% success rate, these attacks were still more accurate than conventional bombing. Approximately 3,800 Japanese pilots died during these missions. The Japanese military's outlook was dictated by the practice of Bushido, which translates as the way of the warrior. This was a set of codes of honour and ideals which underpinned the samurai way of life. Central to this was the ideal of loyalty and honour until death. The irony of the title lies in the fact that even though the man is not literally a kamikaze pilot, having refused to go through with the mission, his actions are effectively a suicide mission because he returns to a living death where his family and neighbours refuse to acknowledge him. The poem begins by telling us that her father embarked at sunrise. The verb embarked not only means to board a plane, but also has positive connotations, suggesting setting off on a new and exciting adventure. Sunrise or dawn was a common time for surprise attacks to be mounted, but there is also perhaps an allusion here to Japan being known as the land of the rising sun. He appears to be prepared for his mission. He has a flask of water and a samurai sword in the cockpit. The sword, however, is meant neither for attack nor defence, but is instead a reference to the practice of seppuku, or suicide. In the event that a samurai failed to go through with his mission, he was expected to disembowel himself, which was thought to be an honourable alternative to disgrace or execution. The fact that he has a shaven head is slightly puzzling, as this does not appear to be part of the ceremony that pilots engaged in before setting off on their mission, when they were presented with the hachimaki, or headband. And shaving the head in Japan is usually performed as either a punishment or as an act of repentance. It might, however, for the poet suggest a certain purity and resoluteness of purpose. His head is full of powerful incantations. An incantation is a series of words said as a magic spell or charm, suggesting some form of meditation which has given him the courage for the self-sacrifice that he is about to make. The brutal practicalities of the mission are laid bare with the acknowledgement that there is no wastage, as there was just enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. These lines can be interpreted in two ways. Firstly, it will be a one-way journey into the history books, as the attack and the casualties it causes will become a matter of record. Secondly, it can be taken as a euphemism for his death, as he is about to become history himself. The short sixth line, with only 2 stressed syllables rather than the usual 3 or 4, enhances the finality of his intended actions. The second stanza starts with, "but halfway there," overturning our expectations and indicating that all will not go as planned. It is at this point that we find out that our third-person narrator is not omniscient, but limited. She thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down. The use of the modal verb must here demonstrates that they did not talk about it. She is surmising what his thought processes must have been from her own point of view, in the same way that we try to make sense of a death that has happened in unknown circumstances. As she's telling the story, is she trying to rationalise what happened to her children or to herself? The next part of the poem is lyrical and vividly descriptive as she describes what she imagines he must have seen from his cockpit. The little fishing boat strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. The pilot can see the traditional way of life far below him, going on uninterrupted. The simile strung out like bunting suggests celebration and joy, and the description of the sea as green-blue and translucent evokes tranquility and beauty. The calmness of the sea is evident from the way in which, beneath the boats, she imagines that he could see the shapes of dark shoals of fishes. The way in which they arced in swathes like a huge flag waving first one way then the other in a figure of 8 suggests an almost hypnotic grace and agility. The simile, like a huge flag, once more conjures the idea of celebration and joy. The flashing silver as their bellies swivel towards the sun adds to the sense of beauty and wealth inherent in the sea. The use of enjambment across the stanza break here allows the sight of the tranquil scene below him to segue smoothly into a memory of himself as a child at the beginning of the 4th stanza, as he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers bringing their father's boat safe. Cairns are heaps of stones that are set up, usually as a landmark, a monument or a tombstone, and the language used to describe this childhood game perhaps foreshadows his own intended death. The pebbles are pearl grey, evoking their delicate beauty. The turbulent inrush of breakers, which actually brings their father's boat safe, contrasts with his own imminent turbulent inrush, which will take him away from his own children. Perhaps the daughter imagines that her father's memory of waiting for his father to return safely was what triggered his desire to return safely to his own children. It is at the beginning of the 5th stanza that the poet moves briefly from reported to direct speech, as the daughter's own voice interrupts the narrative, and it becomes clear that the audience for this story is her own children, as she appears to answer their request for clarification. Yes, grandfather's boat. The narrative voice returns to the 3rd person limited, as we learn that the sight of the fishing boats and the shoals of fishes would have had particular resonance for the pilot. He was a fisherman, as was his father before him, whose boat, salt-sodden, came safely ashore, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. The listing of all the different types of fish and sea creatures here, and the vivid description appealing to the senses of taste, sight, and touch, all evoke the wealth of the sea, and are perhaps symbolic of what the pilot would be giving up. The 6th stanza marks the beginning of the poem's 2nd sentence. The narrative voice changes to that of the 1st person, as this section is told using direct speech, indicated by the use of italics. The tone also changes as the figurative language disappears. It is only at this point that we learn that he did not go through with his mission, and that he came back. The sense of dishonour and disgrace that this action brought on his family is evident by the fact that my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too. They treated him as though he no longer existed. The man has become a living ghost, living in a kind of limbo, shunned by those around him who once loved him. He is neither berated nor challenged, neither forgiven nor understood. The weight of cultural expectation is too heavy, and the calm and factual tone in which this is relayed implies that the father accepted his fate with resignation. The children at a young age clearly at first do not understand the implications of his return, as they still chattered and laughed in his presence, till gradually we too learned to be silent. The father lives the rest of his life with those around him, living as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. We can only imagine the anguish that tormented him as his children rejected him as a father. The narrative voice returns to the third person limited for the final 2 lines as we learn that, sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. The fact that his daughter is now telling the story to her own children, thus reaffirming the life of someone who had effectively been banished from existence, suggests that cultural attitudes are perhaps changing. It could be argued that putting her father back in his rightful place in their family history is her way of making amends for the pain she must have contributed to her father's life after the war, and of achieving some kind of closure. The poem ends on a sombre note, as she muses on whether her father regretted his decision to turn his plane around that day. The use of the modal verb must again indicates that all she can do is suppose that this was the case. Would a relatively quick and heroic death have been preferable to the living death to which he was condemned? We will never know. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques, and English literature texts.